The night was cold and silent inside the German fortress. Soldiers sat in the dark corridors. They believed their walls were unbreakable. Thick concrete, strong steel doors, and heavy guns gave them confidence. They had survived many attacks before. No normal bomb, no regular tank. No small gun could harm their fortress. The fortress was their shield, their pride, their safe place. But whispers began to spread among the soldiers. Strange news came from the front lines. The Americans were moving a new weapon. A weapon so large, so heavy that trucks shook while carrying it. Some soldiers laughed, saying it was just propaganda. Others felt a chill in their hearts. What kind of weapon could scare even the bravest men? The German officers tried to keep order. They told their men to stay calm. They said no fortress in history had fallen easily. They reminded the soldiers of their strong walls and deep tunnels. But fear cannot be silenced so easily. Every night the soldiers talked. Every day the whispers grew louder. One soldier told another. "I heard this weapon can destroy mountains," another replied. "No wall can stop it, no roof can hold it." The stories became darker. Some said the ground shakes like an earthquake when it fires. Some said it can send a shell the size of a man across miles. Nobody knew the truth, but everyone felt the danger. Even the strongest fortress does not protect against fear. Far away, American engineers worked in silence. They built giant guns called the 240mm Howitzers. They tested them in fields, watching the earth crack open with every shot. The officers looked at each other with silent smiles. They knew they were holding a key to break the enemy's pride. Each shell was massive, weighing as much as a soldier. When it hit the ground, it turned stone into dust. This was not just a weapon, it was thunder captured in steel. The Germans did not know when or where this storm would strike. They only knew it was coming. The fortress that once felt safe now felt like a cage. Every shadow on the horizon looked suspicious. Every distant sound of trucks made the soldiers nervous. Some stood on the walls at night, staring into the darkness. They prayed they would not hear the sound of the monster gun. The officers inside the fortress planned for normal attacks. They expected tanks, planes, and infantry. They placed machine guns at the doors. They filled the storage rooms with food and water. But no plan could prepare them for the thunder that was coming. They were fighting an enemy they had never faced before. They were waiting for something they could not understand. Outside the fortress, local villagers whispered the same rumors. They said the Americans carried a weapon that made the sky scream. Old men shook their heads, saying they had never seen such power. Women held their children close, hoping the battle would not reach their homes. Fear spread like smoke. It touched soldiers and civilians alike. Everyone waited, but no one knew what they were waiting for. The Germans tried to laugh at the rumors. They said, "We have survived bombs before. We will survive this too." But deep inside, every man felt doubt. They wondered if this new American weapon would be different. They wondered if their fortress was strong enough. The fortress that once felt like iron now felt like fragile glass. One night, a German commander walked through the tunnels. He looked at his men, saw their tired eyes. He knew they were brave, but he also knew they were afraid. He told them, "Remember, this fortress has stood for years. It will not fall." His words echoed through the tunnels, but they did not erase the fear. Because outside, in the shadows of the storm, the Americans were preparing. The monster guns were being loaded. The shells were ready. The silence before the strike was the loudest silence of all. The soldiers tried to sleep, but sleep did not come. They dreamed of thunder, of walls breaking, of fire in the sky. They dreamed of a weapon that turned stone into dust. They dreamed of defeat even before the battle began. The fortress was waiting. The Germans were waiting, and somewhere far away, the Americans were waiting too. The storm was not here yet, but the shadows had already arrived. The Germans had only heard whispers, but the Americans were looking at the monster with their own eyes. The 240mm Howitzer was not just a gun. It was a beast made of steel. Its wheels were taller than a man. Its barrel stretched like a black tunnel. When soldiers stood near it, they felt small, like ants near a giant. This was not a weapon for ordinary battles. It was made for crushing fortresses. American engineers had worked day and night to build it. They knew the Germans had bunkers with thick walls. They knew bombs from planes sometimes bounced off without effect. They needed something new, something that would make even the strongest walls cry. The answer was the 240mm Howitzer, a machine that carried the weight of destruction in every shell. Each shell was huge, almost as tall as a soldier's chest. It weighed hundreds of pounds, heavy enough that several men had to roll it carefully. When loaded into the barrel, it looked like a dark stone waiting to fly. The soldiers called it earthquake in a box. They laughed nervously, because they knew its power was beyond imagination. Transporting the gun was not easy. Trucks groaned and shook as they pulled the monster across muddy roads. Bridges bent under the weight, sometimes nearly breaking. Villagers who saw it being moved stood silent. They had seen tanks before, they had seen artillery before, but this was something from another world. The Americans guarded the weapon carefully. No spy was allowed near. No photographs were given to the press. They wanted the Germans to feel the fear of the unknown. They wanted the whispers to grow into nightmares because fear itself was a weapon, and the howitzer carried both steel and fear in its barrel. When the first test shot was fired in a secret field, the earth shook for miles. Birds flew out of trees, cows ran across farms. Men dropped their tools thinking an earthquake had come. The shell landed on a hill of rock. The hill exploded into pieces, dust covered the sky. Officers watching the test nodded silently. They knew the monster was ready. Back in the German fortress, soldiers still clung to hope. They told each other that no gun could break them. They believed their walls were too thick, their bunkers too deep, but every hour, American soldiers pushed the howitzers closer. Every mile they moved, the storm drew nearer. The Germans did not see it yet, but they could feel the shadow. American crews trained with discipline. They practiced loading the heavy shells again and again. They counted every second, making sure they could fire quickly. Their muscles ached. Their hands bled, but none complained, because they knew this weapon could decide the war. Every man wanted to be part of the history that was coming. The gun itself seemed alive when its barrel moved. Soldiers said it looked like a snake searching for prey. When its wheels turned, it groaned like an old giant waking from sleep. And when it fired, the sky itself seemed to break. The blast was not just sound, it was pressure. It hit the chest of every man standing nearby. Some said it felt like the punch of a giant fist. Others said it felt like standing too close to thunder. Officers studied German maps carefully. They marked the fortresses that had laughed at smaller guns. They circled the bunkers that had resisted airstrikes. They whispered, "Let them laugh, soon they will hear our monster." The plan was simple, but deadly. Line up the howitzers, aim at the fortresses, fire until nothing remains. Meanwhile, the Germans waited. They still thought the Americans would attack with tanks and planes. They still believed their bunkers could hold. But some soldiers wrote letters home. They admitted they felt uneasy. They confessed they had heard of a weapon that could move mountains. Their hands trembled as they wrote, because they feared they might never see home again. The Americans gave the monster a nickname. Some called it the Fortress Breaker. Others called it the Hammer of God. Names spread like fire among the troops. Every soldier wanted to see it in action. Every soldier wanted to tell the story of the day the howitzer fired. But the Germans had no such excitement. For them, the unknown was terror. Every hour of silence made their fear heavier. Every whisper about the new gun made their hearts colder. They were trapped inside their fortresses. And outside in the fields, the monster of steel was waiting. The world had never seen a weapon like this before, not in the last war, not in any war. The 240mm Howitzer was more than just a machine. It was a promise, a threat, and a storm. And soon it would speak, and when it spoke, the Germans would understand the true meaning of fear. The morning was gray. Heavy clouds hung over the battlefield. American soldiers moved quietly, their boots sinking into the wet ground. The giant howitzers were already in position. Hidden behind hills and trees, crews whispered to each other, checking every bolt, every wheel, every shell. They knew today was the day the monster would roar. And the Germans inside their fortress had no idea what was waiting for them. Inside the fortress, German soldiers ate their breakfast in silence. Some tried to joke, but their voices were weak. Others stared at the walls as if trying to believe they were unbreakable. Officers walked through the halls,
telling everyone to stay sharp, but deep in their eyes,
even the officers carried fear. They had not slept well. They had heard distant movements in the night. Back on the American side, the order was given. "Load the gun," the commander said firmly. The soldiers lifted the giant shell with straining muscles. Sweat dripped down their faces as they slid it into the barrel. The ground seemed to wait in silence. Men stood back, covering their ears, their hearts pounding in their chests. Then with a thunderous crack, the first shell was fired. The air exploded. The sound rolled across the hills like a wave. Birds shot into the sky, animals scattered from the fields. Even the American soldiers, though expecting it, felt their bodies shake. The ground trembled as if the earth itself was afraid. The monster had spoken, and its voice was louder than thunder. The shell cut through the air like a screaming giant. It traveled miles in seconds, faster than the eye could follow. Inside the fortress, German soldiers suddenly froze. They heard a terrifying whistle in the sky. It grew louder and louder until it felt like the heavens were falling. Then it struck. The explosion tore through the ground near the fortress walls. Stone shattered, dust filled the air. Men were thrown from their feet, ears ringing, hearts pounding. It was not like any bomb they had heard before. This was heavier, deeper, more violent. It was not just an explosion, it was a shockwave that broke courage. For a moment, silence followed. Then the second shot came, another thunderous roar, another scream across the sky. This one hit the fortress wall directly. Concrete cracked, pieces of stone flew like knives. Men inside ran for cover, shouting in panic. "The walls are breaking," one screamed. "This is impossible," another cried. American gunners worked like machines, load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. Each shell was delivered with deadly rhythm. Every explosion shook the fortress more. Every wall groaned under the pressure. The Germans could hardly believe what was happening. Inside the bunkers, dust fell from the ceilings. Lights flickered, pipes broke. Water spilled across the floors. Soldiers covered their heads, their rifles useless in their hands. Some prayed, some shouted, some sat in shock. The fortress that once felt eternal now felt like it was dying. The unbreakable walls were being broken. One officer tried to rally his men. "Hold your positions. The walls will stand," he yelled. But even as he spoke, another blast ripped through the ground. The floor shook, his voice drowned in the thunder. Men ran down the corridors, their faith collapsing with the walls. It was not just a battle, it was a nightmare come alive. The Americans smiled grimly as they watched from a distance. Through binoculars, they saw smoke rising, cracks forming. They could hear faint echoes of chaos inside. They knew the monster was doing its work. And with each shot, the German pride crumbled. Fortresses were no longer safe, no longer untouchable by the fifth shell. The Germans stopped counting. They no longer cared about numbers. They cared only about survival. The fortress shook with every impact. Men clung to the walls, whispering to each other. "What is this weapon? How can we fight it?" But there was no answer. No soldier could stop a mountain falling from the sky. Hours passed, but for the Germans, it felt like years. The thunder never stopped. The ground never rested. The fortress was bleeding dust and stone. And with every roar of the howitzer, the end drew closer. For the first time, the Germans inside knew the truth. They were not fighting men anymore. They were fighting a monster of steel and fire. The first strike was not the end, it was the beginning. A message written in smoke and rubble. The Americans had shown their power. The Germans had felt their fear. And the world had witnessed the birth of a new kind of war. The monster had roared once, and it would roar again, and each time it roared, another fortress would fall. Smoke curled into the gray sky. The fortress that once stood proud now looked wounded. Cracks spread across its walls like scars. Every strike from the American howitzers cut deeper. Dust filled the air, mixing with the smell of fire. The fortress was no longer a symbol of strength. It was becoming a grave. German soldiers coughed and covered their faces. The air inside was thick with choking smoke. Lights flickered. Sparks jumped from broken wires. Pipes burst, spilling water across the stone floors. Men slipped as they ran, shouting orders that no one could hear. The thunder of the shells drowned every voice. Another blast shook the fortress. The roof above one bunker collapsed. Crushing men beneath stone, the survivors screamed, pulling at the rubble with bleeding hands. But the howitzers gave them no time to breathe. Another shell fell, and the walls shook again. The fortress felt as if it was alive, crying under every strike. German officers tried to keep control. They shouted commands, waved their pistols, forced men back into positions, but fear spread faster than their orders. Soldiers abandoned their posts, running deeper into tunnels. Some pressed their backs against the walls, trembling like children. They had never felt such power before from a distance. American spotters watched through binoculars. They saw smoke rising from the fortress towers. They saw pieces of stone flying into the air with every hit. They knew the monster howitzers were working. One officer whispered, Keep firing. Don't stop until it's dust. The crews nodded and loaded another shell. The sound of the howitzer was more than just noise. It was a rhythm, a hammer beating against German pride. Boom, pause, boom, pause. Each strike was like a drum of doom. American soldiers felt the vibration in their bones. Even miles away, villages shook under the roar. Inside the fortress, panic spread like fire. One soldier held his helmet tight. Rocking back and forth, another screamed for his mother, tears streaming down his dusty face. Some fired their rifles at the sky, as if bullets could stop thunder. But deep down they knew the truth. They were trapped inside a burning cage. Flames licked through broken corridors. A storage room had caught fire after a shell strike. Boxes of ammunition exploded, sending shockwaves through the tunnels. Men fell, ears ringing, unable to stand. The fire spread quickly, turning shadows into dancing red light. Smoke blinded the soldiers, and fear swallowed their courage. The German commander tried to send a message. He shouted at his radio operator, "Call for reinforcements. Now." But the lines were broken, the wires snapped. The fortress was cut off from the outside world. There would be no help, no rescue, only fire and steel. The Americans kept their distance, calm and steady. They knew charging the fortress was suicide. But with the howitzers, they did not need to charge. The guns did the work for them. Each shot was like a fist-smashing stone, and soon there would be nothing left to defend. German soldiers tried to fight back. They rolled out smaller cannons, firing blindly into the hills, but their shells fell short, exploding harmlessly in the fields. The howitzers were too far, too strong, too well hidden. It was like throwing pebbles at a hurricane. Their weapons were useless against the monster. Hours passed, and the fortress turned into ruins. Once proud towers now leaned like broken trees. Walls that stood for years now crumbled under the weight of steel. The ground was blackened, the air thick with ash. Every corner echoed with cries, every corridor with fear. The fortress was no longer a fortress, it was a furnace. American soldiers whispered among themselves. Some felt pity, others felt satisfaction. One young soldier said softly, "Imagine being in there." "No way out," another replied. "That's why they're terrified. They thought nothing could touch them." The crews kept firing. Their hands steady, their faces hard. They knew this was history being written with fire. As night fell, the flames glowed brighter. The fortress looked like a giant torch against the darkness. Sparks shot into the sky, drifting like dying stars. The Germans inside were exhausted, coughing, bleeding, broken. Some begged their officers to surrender, but others still clung to hope, refusing to admit defeat. The howitzers did not rest even under the stars. They kept firing. Boom after boom, the fortress burned deeper into the earth. Every shot told the same story. Every shot whispered the same truth. The fortress was finished, its time was over by midnight. The Germans realized they were no longer defending a fortress. They were only defending rubble and fire. The walls had betrayed them. The stone had failed them. The monster of steel had turned their pride into ashes. And yet the worst was not over, because the flames were still rising and the thunder had not stopped. The fortress burned through the night. Its towers collapsed, its walls split apart. The thunder of the American howitzers echoed for miles. Villagers who lived nearby could not sleep. Their windows rattled. Their roofs shook, their children cried. They whispered to each other, "The monsters have come." In the towns beyond the battlefield, news traveled quickly. Refugees arrived with dust on their clothes and terror in their eyes. They told stories of a weapon that roared like thunder and broke stone like glass. They said the Americans had brought a gun so powerful that no fortress could stand. Every person who heard the stories felt a chill. Fear began to spread faster than the fire itself. German soldiers stationed in other fortresses heard the news. At first they refused to believe it. They said, "Our walls are thicker. Our defense is stronger." But when messengers arrived, their voices shaking, the truth became clear. The mighty fortress they trusted had been shattered. And if one could fall, all could fall inside army barracks. Whispers replaced laughter. Soldiers spoke in low voices. Afraid their officers might hear, some said, "The Americans have a weapon from another world." Others swore they saw shells explode like volcanoes. The details were wild, but the fear was real. It did not matter what was true, only that men believed it. German officers tried to control the panic. They gave speeches, promising that their army was still strong. They reminded their men of past victories. But the faces staring back were pale and doubtful. No words could erase the images of fire and rubble. The soldiers had already imagined their own fortresses burning. In the villages, people prayed at night. They begged for the storm to pass them by. Mothers held their children close. Fathers stood helpless at their doors. Every distant boom from the battlefield made them jump. Every rumor of the howitzer spread like wildfire, and soon, the fear reached places where the gun had not even fired. American soldiers noticed the change too. Prisoners captured from nearby units trembled as they spoke. One confessed, "We cannot fight this weapon. It is too strong." Another admitted, "Our men are losing hope. They are ready to run." The Americans realized their monster gun was not only breaking walls, it was breaking the will of the enemy. In German command centers, arguments erupted. Some generals demanded new strategies. Others shouted that no fortress should be abandoned. But even as they argued, reports kept arriving. Every report carried the same message. The men are afraid. The men do not believe the walls will save them. The howitzer had become more than a machine. It was now a shadow that haunted German dreams. Even soldiers miles away could hear its roar in their minds. Some refused to eat, others refused to sleep. They imagined the sky splitting open at any moment. They imagined their own walls crumbling into dust. Fear spread into the hearts of young recruits. Boys who had never seen battle now dreaded their first day. They asked their officers, "Will we face the monster gun?" The officers gave no answer. Their silence was louder than words. The recruits knew the truth without being told. In the fortress ruins, survivors carried their fear with them. Those who escaped stumbled into villages, eyes wide, voices broken. They described the ground shaking like an earthquake. They described fire raining from the sky. People listened in horror, their imaginations adding even more terror. The legend of the monster grew larger with every telling. American commanders understood the power of fear. They did not hide the destruction. They allowed rumors to grow. They wanted every German soldier to hear the story. They wanted their enemy to lie awake at night, trembling, because a frightened soldier fights with half a heart. And fear can destroy faster than any gun. In the streets of German towns, ordinary people whispered. They asked, "If the fortresses cannot stop the Americans, what can?" Merchants closed their shops early. Families packed their belongings. The sound of airplanes overhead made them panic. Even if no attack came, their minds were already broken. They lived in the shadow of the weapon they had never seen. Back at the front, German morale sank lower. Some men refused orders, others pretended to be sick. One unit even abandoned their posts during the night. They left their fortress dark and empty. When their officers discovered it, they were shocked, but deep down they understood. The men did not flee from bullets. They fled from fear. The Americans kept firing, not just at stone, but at courage. Every blast carried a message across the fields, a message that no wall could protect the Germans anymore. And that message spread from soldier to soldier, from village to village, from town to town, until the entire land trembled at the thought of the howitzer. Fear had become its own army. It marched ahead of the American guns. It entered German hearts before the shells arrived. And once fear had taken root, no wall, no officer, no speech could drive it away. The fortresses were falling one by one, but in truth, the Germans were already defeated inside their minds. The fortress groaned like a wounded giant. Its walls cracked wider with every strike. Smoke poured from its broken towers. The ground shook as the howitzers fired again and again. What was once a symbol of German pride now stood as a trembling ruin. The collapse had begun and no one could stop it. Inside the fortress, the scene was chaos. Men stumbled through dark tunnels filled with dust. Their helmets rattled on their heads. Their rifles slipped from their hands. The air was so thick with smoke that breathing felt like drowning. Some soldiers lay on the floor, coughing until blood stained their lips. Others ran blindly, searching for doors that no longer existed. Another shell landed and a massive wall caved inward. Stone blocks crushed everything beneath them. The sound was like thunder splitting the earth. Men screamed, their voices lost in the roar of the blast. The fortress trembled as if it would sink into the ground. Hope crumbled along with the walls. German officers shouted orders, but their voices were broken by fear. One yelled, "Hold the line! Defend the bunker." But the men no longer listened. They knew the bunker was no safer than the courtyard. Every corner shook, every ceiling dripped dust. It felt like the entire world above was falling down on them. The Americans kept their distance, calm and steady, Their howitzers roared in rhythm. Boom, reload, aim, boom. The gun crews moved like machines, their arms aching but their spirits strong. They knew victory was near. They knew the fortress was already lost. Through binoculars, American officers watched the walls collapsing. They saw towers lean and crash into the ground. They saw smoke rise higher than the trees. They saw German soldiers fleeing like shadows in the night. One officer said quietly, "The monster has done its job." But still, he ordered the firing to continue. Inside the ruins, panic ruled. Soldiers fought to escape their own fortress. Doors were jammed, corridors blocked by stone. Some clawed at the rubble with bare hands, tearing their fingers bloody. Others pressed themselves against the walls, whispering prayers. The fortress that once promised safety had become their tomb. One section of the fortress burst into flames. A fuel store had been hit, and fire rolled through the tunnels. Heat scorched the soldiers, forcing them deeper underground. But underground was no escape. The deeper they went, the more the walls cracked. The fortress was eating itself alive. The German commander finally understood the truth. His men could not fight, they could not even stand. Their fortress was no longer a weapon. It was a trap, he shouted to his aides. "We cannot hold. We must surrender." But even surrender seemed impossible. The radio was dead, the phone lines cut. The commander stood in the smoke, realizing he had lost everything outside. American soldiers saw white cloths waving weakly from broken windows. Some Germans tried to signal surrender, their arms shaking. Others crawled out through gaps in the walls. Hands raised high, they were covered in dust and ash. Their eyes empty, the fortress had stolen their strength, their pride, their fight. They were soldiers no longer, they were broken men. American troops advanced carefully. They moved past the smoking ruins. Rifles ready, but there was little resistance. The howitzers had already fought the battle. The men inside had no will left to fight. They dropped their weapons as soon as they saw the Americans. The sight of the fortress collapse spread quickly. News reached nearby German units. They heard that the walls had fallen. The men had surrendered. Fear grew into despair. If the strongest fortress could not survive, what hope did they have? The collapse of stone was also the collapse of spirit. American soldiers walked through the ruins. They saw shattered cannons, melted steel, broken helmets. They smelled smoke and ash and blood mixed together. The silence inside was heavier than the thunder outside. Every corridor told the same story. The fortress had died under the weight of the monster. Some German survivors sat in corners, rocking silently. Others stared blankly at the floor, their ears still ringing. One whispered again and again, "The walls lied to us." "The walls lied," another muttered. "We never had a chance." They were not just defeated by shells. They were defeated by fear. The Americans did not celebrate loudly. They stood in silence, staring at the destruction. They knew they had witnessed something new in war. The age of fortresses was over. No stone could resist the power of the 240mm Howitzer. The collapse of this fortress proved it to the world. And yet, as smoke still rose into the night sky, everyone knew the monster would fire again. Other fortresses still waited. Other battles still loomed. The Germans would try to stand again. But the shadow of the collapse would haunt them, because once a wall has fallen, it never feels strong again. The fortress lay silent. Where once there were proud towers, now there were only broken stones. Where once there were strong gates, now there were twisted piles of metal. The great German fortress, the shield of the Reich, was gone. It had not fallen to soldiers charging with rifles. It had not fallen to tanks rolling across fields. It had fallen to thunder carried by the 240mm Howitzers. American soldiers walked carefully through the ruins. The air was thick with smoke and the bitter smell of gunpowder. Every step crunched over shattered bricks and burned wood. They passed soldiers who sat with their hands raised, their eyes empty. These men had been defenders once, but now they looked like ghosts, their uniforms torn, their courage gone, their voices broken. The Americans spoke little. They did not need to say much, the destruction around them spoke louder than words. They knew they had seen the end of an era. No fortress, no matter how strong, could stand against the monster of steel. And the world would remember this day. German officers who were captured admitted the truth. They confessed that their men had been terrified. They said no speech, no command, no punishment could keep order. The howitzer had not only destroyed walls, it had destroyed faith, one officer whispered. It was like fighting a god with bare hands, another said. We built fortresses for protection, but they became our graves. News of the collapse spread far beyond the battlefield. German towns heard of the surrender, and fear deepened. Families packed their belongings. Soldiers deserted their posts. Some civilians whispered that the war was already lost. If the strongest fortresses could not survive, what could? The shadow of the howitzer stretched across the land. On the American side, pride grew. Soldiers told stories of the giant gun that roared like thunder. They described how the ground shook with every shot. They laughed about how even their own ears rang for hours. But beneath the laughter was respect. They knew the monster was more than a weapon. It was history being written with fire. American commanders reported their victory. They praised the crews of the howitzers. They knew the weapon had changed the war. With it, they did not need to storm every wall. They could stand miles away and still crush the enemy. The howitzer gave them time, gave them power, gave them fear to use as a weapon in the ruins. German survivors spoke in hushed voices. They would never forget the sound of the shells. They would never forget the walls shaking like paper. Some swore they still heard the echoes in their dreams. Others could not even speak, their minds broken by the roar. For them, the war was already over, even if the fighting continued. The fortress that once symbolized strength became a warning. Its ruins stood as proof that no wall was unbreakable. Soldiers passing by looked at it in silence. Some crossed themselves, others shook their heads. They knew they might face the same fate one day, and the thought filled them with dread. The Americans photographed the ruins. The images traveled back home. Families saw what their sons had accomplished. They saw that the war was turning in their favor. They saw the strength of American steel, and the 240mm howitzer became a symbol of unstoppable power. But with power came fear for everyone. Even American soldiers admitted the weapon was terrifying. One said, "It shakes the ground under our feet." "It feels alive," another said. "When it fires, I wonder if the sky itself will crack." They respected the monster, but they also feared it, because a weapon that could crush stone could also crush anything. The Germans tried to rebuild other defenses. They dug deeper tunnels, they built thicker walls, but in their hearts they already knew the truth. No wall could promise safety anymore. Every fortress was only waiting for its turn to fall. The collapse of one fortress was the collapse of them all. As the war moved forward, the memory of the howitzer followed. It was not just a gun, it was a legend. It lived in the stories of prisoners, in the nightmares of survivors. It lived in the reports of commanders, in the pride of American soldiers. It became a shadow that walked ahead of every battle. The Germans feared it even before it arrived, and so the legacy of the 240mm howitzer grew. It was remembered not only for its fire, but for its fear. It was remembered as the weapon that broke the unbreakable, the weapon that turned fortresses into ashes, the weapon that taught the world that no wall is eternal. Its thunder became history, and its shadow became legend. The fortress was gone, the battle was over. But the story of the monster had only begun, because every time soldiers heard thunder in the distance, every time the ground shook beneath their boots, they remembered the collapse, they remembered the fear, they remembered the monster of steel that changed the war forever.